I think we're in a pretty good place, not a perfect place, but a pretty good place now of understanding what the department, what they don't like to see, and have a very broad formula for maximizing your credit if it comes to a place where you think you're facing an FCPA violation.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard, for our continuing series, The Corruption Files. Today, we're going to look at some cases from the tech industry. And as we said in the green room, these cases were wild. They were a lot of fun at the time. They were a lot of fun to review. And I think they're going to be a lot of fun as we talk about them here today. So first of all, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, welcome back, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be back.
So, Mike, I picked three cases for the tech series: Hewlett-Packard or HP, Microsoft, and Panasonic. Hewlett-Packard was an earlier case, but it had some very significant consequences from it that still resonate with us today that we'll touch on. Microsoft, I wanted to bring that up because the response by Microsoft moving to a much more robust data analytical model is something that led the compliance discussion, and Microsoft was really a leader in that area. And then Panasonic, because it was so wild. And if you had taken this story to Hollywood, they would have rejected it because they would have said, sorry, all fiction has to be based in fact. So with that, Hewlett-Packard had multiple bribery schemes in multiple countries. They had a corrupt agent in Germany. In Poland, they had literally $600,000 in cash paid out of a trunk by a country manager to a corrupt government official, although not at the same time, over 18 months. And then in Mexico, they had a corrupt agent. With Microsoft, they got into trouble for their distributor model in Poland, and Panasonic really just took the cake. They had bribery and corruption literally across the globe, and they even managed to have it inside the United States. There's only a very, very few FCPA cases where there is a discussion of bribery and corruption inside the United States, but Panasonic had all three. So maybe I think we may spend some time with this one today, but what did you see from the prosecutorial perspective that intrigued you about these cases?
I think a couple of things. When we were discussing the Panopena cases a few episodes ago, I mentioned that I thought it was those cases sort of set the seeds for the corporate enforcement program. There just seemed to be a focus on this voluntary disclosure, especially that aspect of the corporate enforcement program. This focus on voluntary disclosure and the ability to sort of see the real benefits of that. When you look at especially these three cases, you can really start to see a focus on cooperation, right? Some of these cases are absolutely, as you mentioned, wild. The facts are wild. The conduct is in some places egregious, but there is a focus in the, towards the end of these charging documents and settlements, and really talking about all the efforts the companies made to cooperate and giving them credit for that. And I think that at the time, really, it was a focus. It continues to be a focus today. And this sort of, I don't want to say started it, but you could really start to see it around this time frame, especially starting around HP in 2014 and moving forward. And the other thing that, and I'm not just saying this because these are tech companies, but you can really start to see more of an emphasis on data analytics with these cases. And, the documents really talk about the lack of data analytics and where it could have benefited these companies in terms of, looking at agents and sort of comparing their success rates, or, doing sort of global looks at your distributor models and those types of things where really these companies, I think, had the tools to do it. And as you mentioned, Microsoft really sort of took off from here and implemented it. But we now talk a lot about data analytics, and the DOJ has added it to its compliance guidelines, if you will. And I think this was sort of the start of that emphasis that ultimately culminated with the DOJ formally expecting it to be a part of an effective compliance program.
So let me go back to HP for a couple of reasons. One was the bribery schemes involved. And let me start with the most basic. So I'm a Texan. Bags of cash across the border are something well known in this state. So I'm always intrigued when you do it the old-fashioned way. You don't have too many of them, but literally the Poland country manager paid $600,000 to a government official to get contracts over 18 months out of his trunk. So the basic question was, did anyone notice some of our petty cash was missing? And to this day, you have to counsel clients, and I have on, let's look at your petty cash file. What are these expenses for? Who has authority over your petty cash? Is there a segregation of duties? Do you require a dual signature for a check that's written out of petty cash? Why are you paying cash for local services when you could write a check? There's a variety of answers. Some are legitimate business reasons, but you still have to pay attention to your petty cash. The second bribery scheme used by HP was in Munich, or in Germany. And here the Munich operation sold software into Russia. And they needed a corrupt agent to pay the bribe. And so I think it was within 2 weeks of the closing, an agent pops up. And someone who'd never been an agent in the tech arena before. And they received $10 million out of a $44 million sale as their commission. That money went to the Isle of Man and was never seen again. So had multiple failures around due diligence. But then we learned that this same deal had been proposed inside of HP in the United States and have been rejected for those very, very reasons. And somehow the Germany business unit got a hold of it. But there were two best parts. Best part number one was there was a contract accountant in Germany who reviewed this deal, and he was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal. And he said, quote, "It didn't make sense," end quote. He said, "It didn't make sense to me why we were paying $10 million commission for a $44 million sale to someone who had not gone through due diligence. And when I looked at them, they were not in the industry with no internal approvals." So he took that deal to his superiors in the business unit, and Ops approved it, management approved it, the CFO approved it, legal approved it, and he said, "I was just a contract accountant. I wasn't going to say no." So that actually drove home to me the message that everyone in your team needs to be trained, even those who may be contract, if they are in a high-risk situation. But here's favorite fact number two. This was discovered by the Munich tax assessor, the tax assessor from the province of Bavaria, who looked at transactions doing a tax audit. Now, I don't know what, you live in Maryland or D.C.?
D.C.
I don't know what the tax audit expertise is like, but the tax audit expertise in Texas, it would be very unusual for a tax auditor to pick up a suspicious payment to an agent. But this auditor, a state employee, flagged it and sent it to Berlin, which started the investigation. So I've always been intrigued by that the system actually worked to some extent. The last bribery scheme was in Mexico. And here we had a precursor to Panasonic, because what happened was It was a sale to Pemex. The business unit wanted to make a bribe payment to a Pemex purchasing official. They were going to fund it through an agent. It's going to be 25% of the total purchase price. And the agent failed due diligence. They could not get him through. So the system worked internally. However, not to be denied, the Mexican business unit simply took that agent and appended him to a previously approved agent as a sub-agent. They jacked up the commission rate of the approved agent from 1.5% to 26.5% and paid the bribe through that mechanism. And so we had the anomalous situation of a non-corrupt agent who had his commission rate changed, and that was approved by accounts payable, but it never went to compliance. So we've seen those bribery schemes, as I mentioned, going forward. What do you see sort of from all of that or from some of the other bribery schemes from a prosecutorial perspective?
Yeah, I was chuckling a little bit when you were talking about petty cash. There's nothing really petty about the amounts that were being paid in cash in Poland there. And I think, from a prosecutorial perspective, what we see often, petty cash is just such low-hanging fruit, particularly if it's large amounts of petty cash. And, in the best circumstances, it's difficult to place controls around petty cash. And so I think a lot of prosecutors, especially once an investigation is going and they're seeing some evidence of corruption, are very skeptical about petty cash and the use of it. And this is exactly why. It's these types of cases, which you don't see quite as much anymore, for better or worse. Not as good for TV, right? This is the suitcase full of cash. It still does happen occasionally, and it's always kind of wild when it does. And then I think for the other pieces of this, particularly in Mexico, right? You have your compliance controls, due diligence, and everything else, and you might have your financial internal controls, accounts payable, and making sure that all of that is squared away and is appropriate for the size of your business. I think this is a reminder that the two should be connected, because otherwise, enterprising wrongdoers will find the gaps, and just as they did here, let's get through due diligence, and then we can play games on the back end before the payments are made. And so that was something that sort of stood out to me with respect to this case. And then I think when you put this in context, in the historical context of it, the time frame in 2014, it's interesting to think about the industry. This was not at the time considered to be a high risk industry from an FCPA perspective, right? This is at the time we were dealing with the healthcare, we were dealing with oil and gas type cases. I think defense had historically been thrown into the mix as a high risk industry, but technology was not necessarily that way. And this sort of drove home the point that if you are doing business with a foreign government, especially if you're making sales to a foreign government, that's putting a target on your back, and that's a risk from an FCPA perspective, and you have to make sure that your controls are appropriate.
So let me pick up on this agent scheme that was used by HP, because that really came to the fore in Panasonic. And here we had a situation where there were 13 agents across Central Asia, and they were up for 11 of them were up for renewal. None of them could get past the agent due diligence process. And so what enterprising Panasonic employees did was simply append these 11 corrupt agents to the 2 that had been previously approved. And rather than change the commission rate, what happened was these 2 agents who had been humming along with annual commission rates of around $1 million went up to $13 million in 1 year. And that didn't raise any red flags. But even more importantly, and I still don't know why this was in the settlement documents with Panasonic, but they specifically named Trace as having certified the agents. And I thought that was a little unfair to Trace, but Andrea Raggi, the founder of Trace, explained it as well as it could be explained. And I'm going to read from this. In a Wall Street Journal article, she said, due diligence is, quote, is a process, not an event. And that's something we've talked about in earlier episodes. And I'm sorry Trace was named in that way, but Alekhandra is absolutely right. Due diligence is a process. And if you have previously approved agents whose commissions go from $2 million to $13 million, you need to look at that. And there needs to be a business reason for doing so. And then on Microsoft, you touched on Microsoft response. But to drive home the message of how Microsoft used this as an opportunity to really move into transaction monitoring, I'm going to quote from an email Microsoft President Brad Smith sent to Microsoft employees. He said, quote, we've increased our capability to prevent potential violations by using machine learning to help identify transactions and automatically flag those that pose heightened compliance risks. We now run billions of dollars of deals in 57 countries through this program and have a team apply additional scrutiny to these transactions. And so we saw Microsoft, perhaps not unsurprisingly, really lead in the area of data analytics with machine learning. I cite all of those for the maybe lead to the next topic, which was, once again, you touched on this, some of the discounts given. HP came out the same week as a case called Parker Drilling. And Parker Drilling had C-suite involvement in the bribery scheme. And Parker Drilling got a significant discount from their overall fine and penalty. And frankly, none of us could figure that out. HP got a significant discount off their fine and penalty. And once again, a lot of us were scratching our heads. What we didn't know was, and I later visited with Pat Stokes, who was the head of the FCPA unit at that time, they wanted to credit companies for cooperation during the investigation and remediation. When I was involved from the corporate side, you didn't remediate until you'd receive your enforcement action. That significantly changed, and the DOJ gave significant credit to HP, but they also gave credit to Panasonic in the form of a 20% discount. Microsoft also received a discount. So I was wondering if you might talk about how you use that information to help counsel clients if they do find themselves in that situation, that get ahead of this even if you're under investigation.
Yeah, look, it's much easier now than it was in 2018 with Panasonic, and especially 2014 with HP. Because we have such clear guidance, and it's almost a formula in terms of the corporate enforcement policy where they're telling you exactly how it's going to work. And we now have a long history where it's very clearly described. This company got 25% off the full amount allotted because they didn't voluntarily disclose, but they cooperated, including doing all of these things. I mean, the DOJ especially is very careful in laying out exactly what the company did or what they didn't do, right? So they might say, the company was awarded only 15% discount because although they cooperated, the cooperation wasn't timely, or they didn't, make all witnesses available. So you can really start to as an advisor now, you've got a lot of examples of how this can work, and you can put money on it, right? I mean, when you can see these large settlements and where a company, only got a 15% discount instead of 25%, you can value that 10%. Say, hey, this full cooperation, it can be worth as much as X. So it really is a lot easier. It wasn't, I'll be honest, in 2014 especially, it would not have been as easy to convince a client to, one, just open up and cooperate, right? From day one, make all your documents available, do your investigation, share your findings, be fully open and transparent. That wouldn't have been as easy of a sell in 2014. And then on the remediation, I think you raise a good point. Right? Because for a long time, the model was, let's get this thing resolved. Once it's resolved, we'll figure out what we need to do to remediate and fix. And now that has shifted. And I think when we look back now, it seems like it started shifting around this time period, where as soon as you are done your internal investigation, maybe even before you're really officially done, you're advising clients, hey, we're going to take these 10 steps to remediate this, in terms of, and that to me includes both backward looking, who are we going to discipline, fire, et cetera, to address the issue as a deterrent, and then forward looking, what processes do we need? What was the root cause? What processes do we need to address that, so that we can present that to the DOJ or SEC, whoever it may be, and say, look, yes, mistakes were made. We're giving you all the information on those. Look at all this stuff that we've done to make sure that going forward, we're a different and better company, and can be a trusted company. And that helps both in reducing the total penalty as we've seen. And then it's an argument you make too when there's considerations about whether an independent monitor should be appointed. A remediation, particularly on the compliance and control front early on, puts you in a better position to push back on a monitor.
I'd like to maybe change the focus a little bit to the department itself. And we've talked about both the HP case, Panasonic. I threw in Parker Drilling as early precursors to discounts being given. My colleague Mike Volkoff used to say the DOJ always communicates what it's thinking. It's up to you to read the tea leaves. And really, I'm going to stick with Parker Drilling and HP, because at the ACI National Conference in 2014, Pat Stokes, then head of the FCPA unit, for the first time publicly spoke about the cooperation and the credit that was given. Unfortunately, those remarks were in a panel, so there was no text available on the DOJ website. But the next year, in 2015, Leslie Caldwell started talking about the things they wanted to see around cooperation and what they would give credit for. And then, of course, in 2016, we had the pilot program, which we've talked about on an earlier podcast. But there, for the first time, you were told what your credit would be. Then the pilot program led to the FCPA corporate enforcement policy announced by Rod Rosenstein in 2017, which is something that is still with us today. So I was wondering if you might have some thoughts about sort of maybe not the evolution in the DOJ's thinking, but the evolution in their ability to communicate to the white-collar defense bar, to the compliance community, their expectations, and how we can use those expectations to help our clients going forward.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, again, it's easier now than it was then. And although, in 2014, the ACI conference was available, there are now so many opportunities for DOJ officials to speak on the FCPA. There are conferences, there are regional conferences, there are industry specific conferences. And I think to their credit, one of the things that DOJ does a good job of now is, kind of having very planned out remarks for various conferences that are coinciding well with actions, right? So, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Rod Rosenstein announced the corporate enforcement policy at the ACI conference in DC in 2017. And it has become a sort of an expectation that if a high-ranking official from the DOJ is going to be speaking at especially that conference, but others as well, they might say something very worthwhile. And so, whether you can attend or not, that's one thing, but make sure you're following up whether through their press release immediately following or elsewise to hear what they have to say. But then, it's one thing to talk the talk. It's all useless unless you're seeing it in the enforcement actions. And I think it is when to go back to what your colleague mentioned, when what they're saying out loud matches the tea leaves, is when you have this perfect storm, if you will, of being able to say, okay, this is how this is going for a practitioner. It makes it much easier to explain to clients exactly what's happening and exactly what to expect, right? Because I have an example, and I have what the DOJ is saying that example means, and when the two match up, it really makes life easier. And so I don't know if I would call it an evolution. I think what happened is we got a bigger body of FCPA cases. We had the DOJ themselves understanding what's valuable to them in terms of whether it's cooperation or voluntary disclosure, and it might change, and that part of it might have evolved over the years. I think it's been pretty steady now for a few years as to what they're looking for. And then lots of opportunity to sort of communicate that both in action and through speeches and publications and everything else. And so I think we're in a pretty good place, not a perfect place, but a pretty good place now of understanding what the department wants to see, what they don't like to see, and have a very broad formula for maximizing your credit if it comes to a place where you think you're facing an FCPA violation.
Well, Mike, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us next time, where we continue the wild west of FCPA enforcement, this time moving to telecom. And if you think these cases were wild, just wait.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, Tom.